Hi, I'm Dale Wells. Welcome to Lesson 12 in our ongoing study of Transformed, how God changes us from the inside out. This is a Heritage Bible Masterclass study. Maybe you were with us in class and just want to follow up a little bit more by looking at the things that I thought about as I was working through the lesson. Or maybe you weren't able to be with us and you just want to catch up and stay with us, or maybe you want to share this with someone else. Whatever brings you here, welcome. We've been talking about some of the things God uses to transform us. We've talked about how this is a process into which God invites us to participate. We've talked about how we're transformed in our thinking and transformed by training and transformed by worship, how the church transforms us, how habit transforms us, how the Spirit works within us to change us, how we're transformed by following the examples of others who are themselves following the example of Christ. We've talked about the role that our effort works in transforming us, and how faith is a part of transforming us. We've talked about how all this revolves around truth as God has expressed it in His Word. Today we're talking about something that we really don't like to think about, and that is the transforming effect of pain, how pain works to change us. We're looking at a text in Hebrews 12, verses 4 to 13, that really talks about disciplined faith. In your struggle against sin, that's the way the writer talks about it in verse 4 beginning. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as a son." Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children, for what children are not disciplined by their father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Well, looking at the questions, the first thing I asked, looking at that passage, is how does a parent go about transforming a rebellious child into a responsible adult? Do you remember growing up, some of the things that your parents used to say that didn't make much sense to you at the time? Things like, "This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you," or "I'm doing this for your own good," or maybe, "One day you'll thank me for this." I can still hear vividly some of the things my dad used to tell me right before he would discipline me. I mean, think about it. "This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you"? I thought the only parent who might say something like that truthfully might be a porcupine. But as time progressed and I accepted the responsibility of being a father, I came to appreciate my dad's discipline. If you're a believer, you've experienced the discipline of the Lord as He's brought correction and reproof. For that reason, it's worth your time to read this text in Hebrews 12. The writer reminds us that God calls us His children and that we should not take that privilege lightly. Only in the context of that parent-child relationship can we understand the Lord's discipline as an act of love for His children. The writer of Hebrews then compared God's perfect parenting skills to those of earthly, fallible parents. Their discipline is for a brief period based on what seems best at the time. But every parent would admit that they've made mistakes while disciplining their children. Sometimes we discipline from anger or embarrassment. At other times we act without all the facts. But as a parent, God doesn't make mistakes. The Lord disciplines the one He loves. So don't feel sorry for yourselves. That's the way the Message puts verses 5 and 6. So don't feel sorry for yourselves. Or have you forgotten how good parents treat children, and that God regards you as His children? My dear child, don't shrug off God's discipline, but don't be crushed by it either. It's the child He loves that He disciplines. The child He embraces, He also corrects. Look at what He says there in verse 10. God disciplines us for our good so that we may share in His holiness. Now, in that passage, the writer tells us two things about God's discipline. First, it's for our good, and second, why it's for our good. The good news is that God disciplines us for our good. That's what the text says. Even when we don't fully understand it, we can count on the fact that God, in His perfect wisdom and love, will never impose discipline on us that is not in our best interest. Remember, He created us and knows us better than we know ourselves. But the second aspect of the good news is that God's discipline flows from His holiness and from His desire for us to share His holiness. In other words, God disciplines us in order that we may share His holiness. We sometimes misunderstand God's discipline because we lose sight of His ultimate desire for His children, that we share in His holiness. God disciplines us so that we continually become more like Him. When we understand this precious truth, we'll welcome God's discipline as a gift more precious than gold. Well, what does this passage teach us about God? The question in the minds of these first-century Christians who are facing difficulties is, can God protect? The writer of Hebrews makes it clear that when Christians experience trials, it's not because God is unable to protect us. God can spare us from every trial because He is sovereign over every aspect of our lives. Do you remember when the most powerful man in the world threatened 3 Jewish nobodies, guys named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He threatened them with being thrown into a furnace if they didn't kowtow to him. In fact, here's what we read in Daniel 3. Now I'm going to give you one more chance. If you bow down and worship the statue when you hear the music, everything will be all right. But if you don't, you will at once be thrown into a flaming furnace. And listen to this. No God can save you from me. That's the way the contemporary English version puts it. Well, here's the way the men responded. The 3 men replied, "Your Majesty, we don't need to defend ourselves. The God we worship can save us from you and your flaming furnace. But even if He doesn't, we still won't worship your gods and the gold statue you've set up." Jesus put it this way, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." The way Max Lucado writes it, God loves you simply because He has chosen to do so. He loves you when you don't feel lovely. He loves you when no one else loves you. Others may abandon you, divorce you, and ignore you, but God will love you always, no matter what. So when we enter into trials, it's because God has allowed them and maybe even ordained them. It's this realization that sometimes causes believers to question their relationship with God when times get tough. We need to remember that only God can turn a mess into a message, a test into a testimony, a trial into a triumph, and a victim into victory. Well, what does this passage teach us about being transformed? After all, that's what this whole study is about, being transformed. Well, I think what it tells us is the purpose of God's discipline is not to punish us, but to transform us. Look at verse 4. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Now, the writer's point in verse 4 is essentially, put your trials in perspective. You haven't suffered like the martyrs in Hebrews 11, and you certainly haven't suffered like Jesus in Hebrews 12, 1-3. But notice that their struggle is against sin, not against the Roman persecutors, not against the Jewish community that was afflicting them. It's a struggle within themselves against sin. Hebrews 12, 1-3 portrays the Christian life as a race to be run with endurance. The English Standard Version puts it this way: Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. But when we get to verse 4, the picture is no longer about a race. There, the writer conceives of the Christian life as a boxing contest, another Greek sporting event in which we contend through trials against our opponent, and our opponent is sin. We're trading blows with sin. The Message puts it this way: in this all-out match against sin, others have suffered far worse than you, to say nothing of what Jesus went through, all that bloodshed. If we could be rid of our sin, God would have no purpose in allowing us to enter hardship. And when sin is finally gone from the world, then, but only then, will there finally be peace on earth. Given that his readers were enduring hardship, the writer of Hebrews has his principal concern that they not draw the wrong conclusion from their trials. It's easy for us to think we're out of God's favor when circumstances turn against us. What have I ever done to cause this to happen? When trouble comes, don't ever make the mistake of concluding that God has forgotten or betrayed you. So Hebrews 12:5 begins by making a statement that probably is intended as a question. That's the way the New Living Translation puts it. Have you forgotten the encouraging words God spoke to you as His children? Now, those words that he quotes refer back to Proverbs 3, verses 11 and 12, which says, My child, don't reject the Lord's discipline, and don't be upset when He corrects you. For the Lord corrects those He loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom He delights. Understanding this, the readers should not lose heart when God rebukes them through affliction. So what do we learn about ourselves from the fact that God disciplines us? Look at verse 6. The Lord disciplines the one He loves and chastises every son whom He receives. We parents are expected to discipline our own children. We're not expected to discipline other people's children. I'm the father my kids meant when they said, I hope Dad doesn't find out. But I'm also the father they ran to when they were scared, hurt, or in trouble. You see, the same Father who punished Adam and Eve for their sin also gave them the new clothes they needed because of it. So we have to ask the question, is all pain the result of God disciplining us? I think the point is God can use anything that happens, but that doesn't mean He causes it. He may allow it, but He doesn't necessarily cause it. And that's an important distinction. We need to trust that He is still good and loving and wise in everything He does and or allows, even if we don't know why those things happen. Romans 8:28 is a passage people often turn to here. The Greek text literally says, "And we know that to those who love God, all works into good, to those called according to His purpose." Now there are two good translational options. Either all things work together for good, which is what we're familiar with from the King James Version, the New King James Version, the English Standard Version, the Christian Standard Bible, and so on. We know that all things work together for good of those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. That's the way we're familiar with reading this. But there's another equally good alternative translation, and that is that He, implying that God is the He, He's the subject that's being implied, as He is in Romans 8:29, He works all things together for good. That's the way the New International Version, the New Living Translation, and some others put it. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. I really like the way the New Living Translation puts it. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. Note the Bible doesn't say God causes everything, but only that He causes everything to work together for our good. In either case, as C.E.B. Cranfield said in the International Critical Commentary a century ago, what is expressed is a truly biblical confidence in the sovereignty of God. Only God can take the thousands of pieces that make up our lives and put them together like a jigsaw puzzle into a picture that displays His glory. So, does God always tell us why we're going through painful experiences? Going back to that text again, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. We need to remember, the Bible doesn't say God causes everything, only that He causes everything to work together for our good. Do you remember the story of how Jesus healed the blind man outside the temple? John 9, verses 1 and 2, the Net Version, starts out telling it this way. Now, as Jesus was passing by, He saw a man who had been blind from birth. His disciples asked Him, Rabbi, who committed the sin that caused him to be born blind, this man or his parents? You see, the disciples assume that sin, regardless of who committed it, was the cause of the man's blindness. And that was a common belief in Judaism. As a matter of fact, the rabbis used Ezekiel 18, verse 20, to prove the idea that there was no death without sin. Ezekiel 18, verse 20 reads this way, The soul who sins shall die. The Son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the Father, nor the Father suffer for the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. So the soul who sins shall die. The rabbis then concluded, no death if there's no sin. So everyone who dies, dies because of that person's sins. That's their belief. They also used Psalm 89, verse 32, to prove that there was no punishment without guilt. Psalm 89, verse 32, God says, I will punish their sin with the rod, their iniquity with flogging. So, in the case of this blind man, there must have been some sin on the part of his parents or maybe during his prenatal existence. In fact, there was a later rabbinic work that stated that when a pregnant woman worshipped in an idol temple, the unborn child also committed idolatry. And that's just one example of how in rabbinic Jewish thought, an unborn child was thought to be capable of sinning. But now notice, as a kind of a side note, this also affirms that the rabbis believed that life existed in the womb, which leads to the conclusion that abortion is homicide. It's the taking of a human life. Now, the morality of it is another question. The reality is, though, that the old Jewish writers, the old Jewish rabbis, believed that life existed within the womb. Otherwise, there could be no sin within the womb. And they believed that sin could be the cause of a person being born blind, as this man. But going back to the story, Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but he was born blind so that the acts of God may be revealed through what happens to him. That's the way the Net Bible puts it. Most translations assume, and we kind of tend to read it this way, that Jesus is saying in John 9:3, he was born blind so that the acts of God might be revealed through what happens to him. Now think about it. That kind of makes God sound cruel. I made this man suffer this disability for all these years just so I could prove my power to you. But there's an alternative. Put a full stop after neither this man nor his parents sinned. Then take the next expression, that the works of God might be displayed in him, as pointing forward to the miracle Jesus is about to perform, rather than backward to the reason the man was born blind. In other words, Jesus never directly answered their question. Rather, he said something like, it isn't what you assume, and I'm not going to address your speculation as to the reason he was born blind. But as long as I'm here as the light of the world, I'm going to give this man his sight so he can see the light. That's why I like the Message paraphrase here. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause-effect here. Look instead for what God can do. See, many tragic things in life may always hurt and be unexplained. But God may occasionally shine light into our darkness. After a time of grieving, we can find comfort in knowing that God can even use tragedies to bring about good. Well, look at question 7. Why doesn't God always tell us why we're going through painful experiences? Job asked this question. Job 30, verse 20. I shout for help, God, and get nothing, no answer. I stand to face you in protest, and you give me a blank stare. I mean, think about it. The big question of the book of Job is why? And that's the question that's never answered in the book. We may not comprehend what God is doing and how our pain and disappointment fit into his plan. We may come to believe that God has lost control or interest in the affairs of people, and that's the danger. Pain and suffering do not cause the greatest damage. Confusion is the factor that shreds our faith. So, Lou Holtz says it this way. God answers prayers, but he doesn't always answer it your way. And Leonard Ravenhill says this, and I really like this. God doesn't answer prayer. He answers desperate prayer. Have you ever felt that way? That you have to wait till you're really desperate before God takes you seriously? But I think the thoughts here are really important. Prayer does not change God, but it changes him who prays. That's what the theologian Soren Kierkegaard had to say. In other words, the circumstances we ask God to change are often the circumstances God is using to change us. Transformation. You see how it works? So, some people experience pain and get bitter. Others experience pain and get better. What makes the difference? I like the way Viktor Frankl described it. Now, if you've forgotten, Viktor Frankl was a German Jew. As a child, he and his family were put into concentration camps in Germany. He lost his entire family. He was separated from them. They all died. He survived. He became a great psychologist who wrote a number of books that to this day are widely recognized and respected. Here's something he had to say, and remember what he went through before he writes this. Pain from problems and disappointments, etc., is inevitable in life. But suffering is a choice determined by whether you choose to compare your experience and pain to something better and therefore feel unlucky and bitter, or to something worse and therefore feel lucky and grateful. Remember, suffering will change you, but not necessarily for the better. You must choose to grow better, not bitter. You'll let your grief make you bitter. You let your suffering make you cruel. Want to know what that makes you? A villain. That's every comic book villain ever. They suffer, and then they inflict suffering on others. Good guys do the opposite. Good guys suffer too, but they respond by helping. I think Catherine Centers got a good point there when she says this. So, don't let pain turn you into a Cruella de Vil. God has marvelous ways of taking our worst tragedies and turning them into His most glorious triumphs. Even if we may not always understand why God allows certain things to happen, we can know He is able to bring good out of evil and triumph out of suffering. That's what Billy Graham said, and he's right. The truth of God's love is not that He allows bad things to happen. It's His promise that He will be there with us when they do. And R.C. Sproul is right. For the Christian, every tragedy is ultimately a blessing, or God is a liar. What do we need to be careful not to do when we experience pain? James Dobson says this: never assume God's silence or apparent inactivity is evidence of His disinterest. Feelings about His inaccessibility mean nothing, absolutely nothing. His word is infinitely more reliable than our spooky emotions. The Lord is at work in His own unique way, even when our prayers seem to echo back from an empty universe. And the preacher Reuben Welch once said, with God, even when nothing is happening, something's happening. Maybe the best New Testament example of this dynamic revolves around John the Baptist's arrest and incarceration. John was commissioned by God to announce the arrival of the Messiah. Suddenly he finds himself in jail with no prospect of release. And unlike other New Testament heroes who found themselves in similar straits, there's no midnight miracle, no angelic visits, no earthquakes. He didn't even receive a care package from his famous cousin Jesus. There's just the stench of Herod's dungeon. Consequently, his faith took a big hit. He began to doubt. So he sent a message to Jesus through friends. A message that's kind of despairing. He heard about the things the Messiah was doing. He sent his disciples to ask Jesus, Are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else? He's basically saying this doesn't make any sense. Explain, please. And Jesus responded by drawing John's attention away from his immediate circumstances to God's broader activity in the world. He said, go back and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the good news is proclaimed to the poor. In other words, tell John what's going on outside of his misery. Tell him not to let his faith get swallowed up in his immediate surroundings. Point him to the broader context. Doing so will help him rightly interpret what's happening to him. And after Jesus sent John's friends away, he made a remarkable statement to those standing around him. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. The implications of that statement are staggering. Jesus acknowledges that his activity or lack of activity has the potential to undermine our faith. His lack of activity almost undermined John's. And do you know how that story ended? It didn't end well. Jesus never came to his rescue. Apparently, he never even bothered to visit. Eventually, Herod executed John. But apparently, John died with his faith intact. Well, finally, painful experiences are coming. What do we need to know before they come, and how do we prepare for them? When you drive down the road, you keep glancing at your mirrors. You don't spend your time gazing at what's behind. If you do, you'll run into something in front of you. But you do keep the things that are behind you in mind. We always do better going forward if we remember what we've come through. You've heard me say this often. We see the hand of God best in the rearview mirror. Well, it's equally true that, as the mirrors often say, objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. So not only is God present, but he's closer than we think. A few weeks ago, we took a glance at a great psalm on this very thing, Psalm 78. You'd do well to go back and read it. It rehearses how time and time again Israel vexed God because they forgot what he had done. They forgot the plagues. They forgot the Passover. They forgot the Red Sea. They forgot how he brought water out of a rock. They forgot that every morning they got up and just picked bread up off the ground, and God gave them one time more meat than they ever wanted. They forgot how their enemies were routed. They forgot how God gave them a covenant to guide their conduct. When it came time to go into the promised land, emphasize the word promised. God had promised this land to them. When it came time to go into the promised land from Kadesh Barnea, just a little over a year into their exit from Egypt, they doubted that God could do what he'd been doing at that time for over a year. The next 39 years didn't get any better. Psalm 78:32 says, in spite of all this, they still sinned. Despite his wonders, they did not believe. Israel's experiences in the hostile desert ought to have produced faith, but instead they succumbed to fear. Consequently, this generation that could and should have enjoyed the fruit of the promised land died in the desert instead. You've got to keep God's faithfulness in your past experiences in mind as you continue down the road. Let your experiences lead to faith, not fear. Well, that's our look at what it means to be transformed by pain. Our next lesson in this series will be the final lesson, Transformed by God. I hope you'll join us. Between now and then, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.